Cyprus. I spent some time with our team in Russia. So the leaders came out from Russia. I wasn't actually sure they would be able to come out. And then I spent some time with a team from Ukraine, and we also brought those teams together. And so this morning I just wanted to share something of our thoughts about Russia, what is actually going on in Russia at the moment, what is happening in the Ukraine. So our friend who is leading the work in Ukraine is actually Australian, and so I spent some evenings with him just talking about what it's like for them as a team in the Ukraine. I work with a mission called OM, Operation Mobilization, around 6,000 people around the world. My wife is the Associate International Director for OM, just came back last night from Kenya after leading some board training for different members of our teams in Africa. But I think many of you are just, we grew up knowing about the Iron Curtain, sort of under just the watchful eye of Putin and Yeltsin and Gorbachev, and just being full aware of just some of the evils in the history of Russia. And so at this conference in Cyprus were some other teams from Moldova, from Poland, from Romania. And it was good just to be able to spend some time talking with these teams. And like you, I think just outraged about what is going on. And for me, I actually didn't think that Russia would invade. I thought, surely that wouldn't be, I wouldn't say stupid, but it's just like, surely they wouldn't do that to another country that was part of the Soviet Union. And as I talked to my Russian friends at the moment, I rang Russia soon afterwards, and I rang some Russian friends and I said, oh, how are you? And they said, oh, Lloyd, it's okay. We're safe. We're safe. I thought, I'm not actually asking if you're safe. I'm just wondering how you're processing the evil that is taking place. But for them, there's a whole media just dialogue and just message that is going across, obviously very well, that they are just going into Ukraine to deal with the Nazis and the fascists, and that people in the Ukraine want them there. And so it's just this really sad situation. But then just talking to some other Russians who are very aware and very internet savvy and getting all their information, and they're all just saying, we see what's happening and we're demonstrating, but many people are being arrested, and those who are being arrested are also having their homes searched, and so it's very, very difficult to speak out. But my early months and year in mission was spent in the Ukraine, and Ukraine is an amazing place. The people are so hospitable, so friendly, but also because of their history, because of the Soviet Union, they were a broken people. And Stalin and the others wanted to just destroy the language. They are a different people. And if you look at Russian history today within the evangelical church, within the Baptist church, I lived out in Siberia for a number of years, working with the Baptist church, and then in St. Petersburg. But many of the evangelical churches in Russia today were planted by Ukrainians. So near neighbors who understood the culture, but because of the Soviet Union and because of the pressure on them, they were forced to speak Russian. And so many of these people went as church planters to Russia, and very, very effective church planters because of their demeanor and just so servant-hearted. And so if you go to Russia, to Ukraine today, you'll see just a huge evangelical church, especially in the western side, but it's just so very sad about what is taking place. And I just read out a sentence just from one of my friends who's a Russian Baptist pastor in Moscow. And he put up, just shortly after the invasion, just a very brave text, because it was a long text. I thought, wow, You know, his life was already in danger. He was already being watched by the KGB. And this is what he said. I'm just going to read one sentence. And I won't read the whole thing, but this is what he says. He says, "My soul grieves. My heart is torn with horror and shame. And my mind is shocked by this human insanity." I think all of us know the writer Solzhenitsyn. They used to call him Mr. Miserable in Russia. He had his own TV program, but he was so miserable they shut it down. But he wrote a number of books called Gulag Archipelago, and about the prison camps. He spent time in prison in the gulags of Siberia. And he said this one thing in Gulag Archipelago. He said, everyone looks for some great evil elsewhere. And they talk about evil, and they try and recognize evil in other people. And he said, one only has to look at their own soul, at their own heart, and they will see and recognize that the line between good and evil runs down the center of each one of our hearts. And I think that is just so true, is that we see so much evil in the world today. We see it in Russia, but also in parts of the Ukraine as well. But Solzhenitsyn says, don't talk about that. Just look at your own heart. And I think today we've just had communion, and we see how God has reached into each one of our lives. And yet each one of us is still capable of speaking ill and being unkind to other people. And so I just wanted to show you just a very short slide. Well, you can't have a missionary without a PowerPoint. And I'm going to just do it very, very quickly and just relax. My points afterwards, I've got a three message, just 3 short points. I'll get through them very quickly. So just relax. Don't think I'm going to go over time. I was a quantity surveyor by profession, so good. I've got teenage girls who also give me the evil eye if I go over time. So this is Siberia, and so right smack in the middle is Novosibirsk. This is Russia, 11 time zones, St. Petersburg up there in the left-hand corner. And we worked out in Russia, so Siberia minus 40, but this was taken in a place called Yakutsk, minus 60 degrees. And funny enough, up the top there it says optimist. You have to be an optimist to live in Siberia. And so the Russian church, the Baptist church, came to us and said, we've got all these people coming out of drug rehabilitation, coming out of orphanages, coming out of prison. Some of them have found faith in these places, but they need disciple. Can you do something? So they approached our international team, a team of around 40 people, mostly run by Russians now, and they said, could you set up a discipleship center? So they set up a 6-month discipleship center where they just bring them together, 20 or 30 at a time. They live together for 6 months. Built one on the left-hand side, put that up. Teams came out from Australia to put it up. And this is the latest graduation in April. So they had 32 people graduate. And this is the Russian pastors just all praying for them and commissioning them. But there's over 250 people who have graduated in the last 15 years. But it's just an amazing, just a time. So I've been out there a number of times. So just as I was leaving Russia, we got the school going. But just a few years ago, I went back out to Siberia, and the team asked me to just come over and to visit someone. And there's a little girl there in blue, and her name was Gulia. And there's a number of people. The guy in black, his name is Saifullah, and his wife Faruza. They were refugees that came out of Uzbekistan. There was war down there. And they came up to Siberia as church planters, and they were given visas to go to America. And they said, you know what, we just feel like God's calling on our lives just to stay and to work with people from Central Asia with a Muslim background. God's touched our hearts. We'll forego our visas to go to the promised land of America, and we'll stay here and just work in Siberia. And they're despised because of their brown skin, just treated really shamefully. And they invited me over to their house and said, "Can you bring your friends to come and meet Gulia?" I said, "Sure." So I went to meet Gulia and I translated for the other team. And I said, "Gulia, tell me your story." And she said, "Oh, Lloyd, your friends, they're the nicest Muslim people I've ever met." And I said, "What's your story?" And she said, "Lloyd, I was stabbed in the stomach 7 times. And I was dying in the hospital. And I don't have any family to look after me. And someone in the hospital phoned your friends and said, 'Hey, you care for people. Can you come and take this young girl?' And she said, 'Lloyd, I was on the operating table and I saw the vision of a man in white. I'm a Muslim. And I saw a man in white by a waterfall. And he said, drink from this waterfall. This will give you life.' And she said, 'Lloyd, your friends are telling me about this man Jesus and that he will give me living water.' And she said, 'This is fascinating. This is amazing. Your friends are so kind.' And so we spent time with her listening to her story. And then I went back to Siberia just a year later. And Saiful and Feruza rang me and said, 'Lloyd, would you come? Gulia, she's much stronger now. She would like to see you.' And I said, 'Oh, wow. You know what's happened?' They said, 'Well, you can come and hear for yourself.' So I went to see her, and she said, 'Lloyd, I've become a Christian.' Your friends obviously are Christians, and they've explained to me who Jesus is. And she said, 'I found this living water that I was thirsting for.' And she said, 'But Lloyd, tomorrow I'm getting baptized. Would you come to my baptism?' So I went to the baptism, so it's 4 degrees. So Siberian autumn. And so I went to the baptism. And this was the start. And so Gulia got baptized in the bath because she was still very, very weak. And so it was warm water. She is now a church planter down in Central Asia, runs her own business, discipling, just an amazing evangelist, very effective. And then this is just a small church that they've started, but this now is a church building. Sorry, can you just push it through? There's a church building, so 4-story building, but just teams coming out from Australia and Canada, just putting these timber frame buildings up in a few months. Just absolutely amazing. But what's so sad is just talking to the Russia team, is that when you saw those pastors all praying for those young people going out, many of them are being drafted into the army. And they're getting the knock on the door saying, you need to join the army, you have to join the army. And so many of the foreigners, many of the missionaries have been forced to leave Russia. The embassies have asked them to leave. And so much of the work that was just thriving has not come to a standstill, but it's just been really just stripped back. And I know that God can use the Russians, but it's just so very sad because all the families were entwined, that many of the expatriates had very big positions on these teams, in charge of finances and just management. And so when we think of the Ukraine, we also think of Russia, and just that many of the teams and many of the churches are suffering. But some of the things happening in the Ukraine, it's just absolutely awful. But talking to Wayne, who's just come out of the Ukraine, who's married to a Ukrainian woman, he said the church is just thriving, that all the churches are working together. They're opening up their doors. They have an amazing, amazing witness. And that they've just really stood and just served sacrificially. And I'm just thinking about our message today. Pentecost has just come and gone. But as we look at the story of Pentecost, as we look at the early church, we see that the disciples really didn't understand what Jesus was talking about when he talked about the kingdom. We have Judas, who was expecting something so different. So he gave his life to the cause, but he wouldn't give his heart. In Gethsemane, Peter was willing to kill but not die for Jesus. We have the disciples scattered when Jesus needed their support. And yet Jesus gave his commission to go into all the world, and yet there were many who still doubted. And I just love the Gospels because they don't leave out all the kind of sort of negative bits or when people were struggling. We have Judas who committed suicide. We have the disciples who had spent time with Jesus who still doubted. And yet, Jesus commissioned them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some were doubtful. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. I am with you always. But the reality for the early church was suffering, there was persecution, there was life on the margins. And I think for many of them, they probably sensed, where is this power that God spoke about? When Jesus went up, he said, wait in Jerusalem, wait for Pentecost, but where is this power in everyday life? But yet we see from history that the church grew, that it permeated society, that people in position began to take notice of the church. And people began to get scared. A number of the Roman emperors were scared of the influence of the church. But how did the church grow? If you just go through those PowerPoints. The growth was odd. It wasn't really organized. But how did the landscape change? And firstly, just 3 short points. One is that they were called to live questionable lives. And so what do we mean by that? So there was suffering, there was persecution, there was life on the margins, but there was a call to live a life that was different. They were called to live lives that evoked curiosity. And many of these Christians lived lives that surprised the empire. They were an alternate society. They were just ordinary people, but they practiced radical hospitality. They ate with the young and the old, the outsider. And when you look at the word hospitality, it's got the word hospital in there. It's a place where you come together, you share a meal, you get to know each other, where friendships are forged, where broken relationships are restored. They loved people regardless of where they were from. They were generous to the poor. They cared for the sick, and especially when there was a plague. But much of their power came from the margins and from weakness. And Julius, who was one of the Roman emperors, he was scared, and he said to the pagan priests, you know, we pay you guys, you need to mirror what these Christians are doing. I'm going to pay you to mirror that and to copy that and to outdo them. And they tried and they failed because they could not outdo the Christians, because there was some empowering that was happening through those Christians as they worked in community. Just a year ago, we moved to a townhouse. We live in Coogee. We moved from Secret Harbour and got to know our neighbours, and they invited us over the other day. And we all got together from the 4 townhouses, and they said, you know, so we talked, and they said, oh, you know, Lloyd, you know, tell us about Russia. And so we were talking and we were telling them about Russia. And then one of them stopped and said, Lloyd, sorry, you haven't answered my question. I didn't ask you what you did in Russia. I want to know why you did it. And so Catherine and I just looked at each other and said, okay, here's our opportunity. And so we just shared the story of how God intervened in our lives as teenagers. And then the girl stops us and goes, I always wanted to be a Jesus freak. I always wanted to go to church in California. Oh my goodness, that's exactly what I wanted to do. And God just opened up this amazing opportunity just to share about our lives. And you know, God opened up that door. And so I just wanted to share some statistics with you, because the census has just come out, and it's quite sobering about church growth in Australia and how it's just going downhill. But these are some statistics from McCrindle, and
next one.
So I'll just go through that. So religion in Australia is not dead yet. This study shows that 2/3 of Australians currently follow a religion or have spiritual beliefs. The number of Australians who do not identify with a religion or spiritual belief, however, is on the rise. Almost 1 in 3 Australians now do not identify with a religion. More than half of Australians are open to some extent to changing their religious views given the right circumstances and evidence. The greatest attraction to investigating spirituality and religion is observing people who live out of genuine faith. 61% of the 1,000 people who were interviewed said they would be interested. Second is experiencing a personal trauma or significant life change. The top repellent to investigating religion and spirituality is hearing from public figures and celebrities who are examples of that faith. So people like ScoMo, who started to share about their faith, somehow for Australians that was a top repellent. But also there are spaces in society that are perceived to be more appropriate than others when talking about spirituality and religion. The 2 most inappropriate places, so take note, are suggested to be shopping centres when people are in a hurry, deemed as very inappropriate by 23% of Australians, and then community events or groups, that somehow sharing your faith in a community event or group is somehow a turn off. But this was just a really interesting survey about what really is happening in society. But what it was also saying is that many, many people are open to talking about religion, and if they are presented with a good argument, would be interested or open to changing their religious beliefs. And so the question for us today is, how are we going to live a questionable life? A life that evokes curiosity in the people around us. And then just secondly, a call to live attractive lives. Not all of us are given the gift of evangelism, but we are called to have a witness. And we've already had that chapter, those verses written out to us. And it says, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. You know, how are we going to answer those people around us who have questions? We need to live attractive lives, lives that point to Christ. Paul's writings indicate that the church was gifted with some evangelists who were to speak boldly and equip others in the church, but the others were called to live out faithfulness. And I just wonder about us today. How are we going to go about this work? And just to live out our lives and to have a faithful witness. And just thirdly, we're called to live these attractive lives. We're called to live lives that evoke curiosity, but we also need to live a life that is empowered by the Spirit. A call to align ourselves with Jesus' values, to demonstrate our faith, not only in word, but also in deed. And it says, behold, I am sending the promise of my Father upon you, but stay in the city until you are clothed with power from on high. But for many of the people in the church, in the early church, and maybe for you today, you're feeling life on the margins, that you don't have many opportunities. But just amazing what Paul excuse me, what Paul says to the Ephesians, and I'll just finish here. Paul says to the Ephesians in chapter 3, verses 14 to 21, Paul is in prison and he kneels to pray. And he doesn't pray that God would take away the trials and tribulations of the people. He says, I pray that you would be strengthened in your innermost being, that you would be able to contain the fullness of Christ in all his fullness. And then he says, now to him who is able to do exceeding abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us. And I just wonder for us this week as we go out from here, how would it be if God, if Christ in all his fullness would be able to dwell in our hearts? And like Paul, that we prayed for each other, that we would be able to contain Christ in all his fullness, so that he would be able to radiate to the people around us. And here the word that Paul uses, the word power, is dynamite. That's the Greek word here, dynamite. Now to him who is able to do exceeding abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us. And so as we go about our week, let's just think about whether or not our lives are questionable, that we're evoking questions from the people around us. Are we living attractive lives that point to Christ? And are we living lives empowered by the risen Christ? Let's just think about that as we go out, knowing that Christ is able to do immeasurably more than we ask of. Let's just pray together. Lord, we just thank you for our time together, and we just ask that you would take us out from here. Lord, just help us to live lives that bring just glory to you, that draw attention to you and the work in our lives. Lord, we thank you for saving us. Lord, just help us to be a good witness to you and to build your kingdom. And Lord, we just pray for those in Russia and for those in Ukraine. Just pray for your church, that you would just build it and that you would just help them to live amazing lives, faithful lives that point to you despite their difficulties. In Jesus' name.
Thank you, Lloyd. And I won't mention your surname in case I get it wrong. I'll tell you a story about that afterwards. We're going to conclude our time.